The universe has a sense of humor. It's just that most species are too busy contemplating their own greatness to notice. Take the hegemony, for instance, a collection of 12 advanced species who spent roughly 3 millennia perfecting the art of interstellar conquest without actually having to fire a shot. Oh sure, they had warships, impressive ones, with names that translated to things like inevitable dominance and submit or perish. But their true weapon was far more insidious. Psychological warfare elevated to a mathematical certainty. Why waste resources obliterating a civilization, their doctrine stated, when you can simply convince them they've already lost? The hegemony had broken the will of 37 distinct spacefaring civilizations through carefully calculated campaigns of demoralization, gaslighting and despair. Their techniques were documented in a 42-volume manual, updated quarterly and studied religiously by their submission specialists. The Ziril, with their hive-mind consciousness, contributed unparalleled insight into collective psychology. The Morsath, with their 12 distinct emotional lobes, had mapped the neurological patterns of sentient distress across hundreds of species. The Venari could literally smell biochemical changes associated with giving up. Together with 9 other equally insufferable species, they believed they had cracked the universal code of sentient surrender. Then they found Earth. Primitive but peculiar, read the initial assessment. The dominant species had only recently discovered nuclear fission, were still primarily dependent on fossil fuels, and spent an inordinate amount of time watching moving images of situations that weren't actually happening. The hegemony's preliminary scouts observed humans standing in line for hours to ride machines designed to simulate the terror of falling from great heights. For fun, they deliberately exposed themselves to controlled fear stimuli, noted Zif Toril, the hegemony's lead xenopsychologist. Fascinating but ultimately exploitable. The hegemony's predictive algorithms gave humans a psychological resistance index of 3.7 out of 10, firmly in the easily subjugated category. The humans' propensity for internal conflict, their reliance on digital validation, and their curious habit of electing leaders based on how well they performed in front of visual recording devices, all suggested a species ripe for psychological conquest. Begin standard procedure, ordered Grand Manipulator Zev Duran. Will have their planetary leaders signing submission treaties within 2 standard cycles. The hegemony's confidence was absolute. After all, their methods were scientific, their approach refined through successful conquest after successful conquest. Their only concession to human uniqueness was a notation that this species might require slightly more emphasis on exploiting their apparent addiction to conflict-driven entertainment. What the hegemony didn't realize, couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Earth itself had been trying to break humanity since the first primate stood upright and thought, hey, this is actually pretty convenient. The universe's sense of humor was about to become abundantly clear, and the punchline would be delivered at the hegemony's expense. The hegemony's approach to conquest was nothing if not methodical. Phase 1 involved passive observation and data collection, roughly 6 Earth months of monitoring communications, entertainment, and social behaviors. Phase 2 escalated to subtle interference, what they called doubt seeding. Phase 3 introduced targeted psychological pressure points. By Phase 4, most species were already drafting their own surrender terms, just to make the existential dread stop. The Earth campaign requires our finest specialists, announced Grand Manipulator Zev Duran at the Strategy Conclave. We will proceed with Subjugation Plan Delta 7. Delta 7 was overkill for a species with a resistance index of 3.7, but the Grand Manipulator had developed a peculiar fixation on humans. Perhaps it was their unpredictable consumption habits, or maybe their baffling ability to simultaneously revere and ignore expertise. Whatever the reason, he had assembled the hegemony's most accomplished psychological warriors. Chief Despondency Architect Ella Valamore slouched into the room, her 4 eye stalks drooping in a calculated display of disinterest. The Morsath specialist had pioneered the hopelessness cascade technique that had broken the mighty quantum coalition of Rigel. Her specialty was identifying cultural load-bearing concepts and strategically removing them. Humans appear to require constant validation through digital platforms, Ella Valamore noted, flicking through data on her neural pad. Deliciously exploitable. We'll start by manipulating their social hierarchy indicators. Next came Zif Toril, the Ziril xenopsychologist whose hive mind segments could simultaneously process 17 different species' limbic responses. His tentacles twitched with anticipation. Their entertainment contains fascinating psychological contradictions, he chittered. They deliberately consume narratives that trigger grief and distress. They refer to the experience as cathartic, puzzling but ultimately a weakness. Rounding out the team was Kalik Dro, a Vanari whose olfactory bulbs had been surgically enhanced to detect even the faintest pheromones of capitulation. His specialty was what the hegemony delicately called reality destabilization, a combination of gaslighting and perception manipulation that had once caused an entire avian civilization to question whether they had ever truly possessed the power of flight. Their information ecosystem is already fractured, Kalik noted, his nostrils flaring. They distrust their own experts and fragment into belief tribes. We'll simply accelerate the process. The plan they developed was elegant in its cruelty. First, they would subtly alter human communication platforms to amplify division and uncertainty. Next, they would introduce calculated resource scarcities to trigger competition reflexes. Finally, they would deploy tailored existential threats designed to shatter collective resilience. Their research had identified several critical human vulnerabilities: a dependence on social belonging, a fear of meaninglessness, and an aversion to acknowledging mortality. The data suggested that humans, despite their curious penchant for deliberately scaring themselves, were particularly susceptible to genuine existential dread. What the hegemony strategists missed entirely were the context clues. Yes, humans watched disaster movies for entertainment, not because they were masochists, but because they'd been living through actual disasters since they crawled out of the primordial soup. Yes, humans feared death, but they'd built entire civilizations, religions, and art forms in defiance of it. Yes, humans craved belonging, but they'd also perfected the art of stubbornly carrying on alone when necessary. The hegemony had meticulously catalogued human behaviors without understanding the planetary crucible that had forged them. They saw vulnerability where there was hard-won adaptability. They recognized fear, but missed the stubborn determination that inevitably followed it. They were about to learn that their psychological resistance index needed at least one more digit. First contact occurred on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate. Not the drama of a Monday, nor the optimism of a Friday, just the resigned pragmatism of a Tuesday. The hegemony's delegation materialized their shuttle on the manicured lawn of the United Nations headquarters, deliberately scorching an immaculate section of grass as a subtle psychological primer. The shuttle door descended with theatrical slowness, releasing a perfectly calibrated mist designed to trigger subconscious anxiety responses. The hegemony delegates had spent hours selecting appropriately intimidating physical forms from their various shape-shifting capabilities. Ixif Toral had added 2 extra limbs. L.R. Valamor had positioned her eye stalks in an asymmetrical pattern, proven to induce cognitive discomfort. Kalik Dro had adjusted his pheromone output to subtly communicate apex predator status. Grand Manipulator Zev Duran emerged last, having opted for a towering form with iridescent scales and mathematically perfect facial symmetry, a combination their research suggested would trigger both fear and submission reflexes in primates. "We come in peace," Zev Duran announced, the translator rendering his speech in precisely the sort of too-smooth voice that humans instinctively distrusted, while consciously believing they should not. It was the vocal equivalent of a corporate wellness program. Technically benevolent but fundamentally unsettling. The Earth delegation stood waiting, a carefully selected group, representing major governmental powers. At their center stood the human designated as their primary diplomatic representative, a middle-aged individual of unremarkable appearance, wearing what the hegemony's fashion analysis identified as business casual, with a desperate attempt at authority. Ambassador Thomas Chen, the human, introduced himself with a slight nod. "Welcome to Earth. We appreciate you using the landing coordinates we provided, though our groundskeeping staff will be sending you the bill for the lawn." This was not in the hegemony's predicted response matrix. Humor as a defense mechanism they understood, but this carried no detectable anxiety markers. The Grand Manipulator recalibrated. "We have observed your world for some time," Zev Duran continued, activating subtle harmonic resonances in his voice, designed to induce mild vestibular disturbance. "Your species shows great potential." The hesitation before potential was deliberate, a microaggression technique that had reduced a planetary chancellor on Proxima Centauri to tears during preliminary negotiations. Ambassador Chen merely raised an eyebrow. "How nice. We've been looking at the stars for quite some time ourselves. Though I admit, we expected first contact would involve more discussion about universal constants, and less about our lawn maintenance." As the delegations moved inside for formal talks, the hegemony deployed their first wave of subtle psychological tactics. The room temperature was adjusted to precisely 2.7 degrees below optimal human comfort. The chairs provided to the Earth delegation were engineered to trigger minor but cumulative discomfort over time. The lighting was calibrated to fall within the spectrum that induced mild concentration difficulties in primates. None of it seemed to affect Ambassador Chen. 8 hours into negotiations that should have left the humans disoriented and anxious, he remained composed, occasionally making notes on an actual paper notebook, a deliberate rejection of the advanced data tablets the hegemony had provided as gifts. "Perhaps we should continue tomorrow," Chen suggested eventually. "Some of us still need to sleep the old-fashioned way." He stretched casually, seemingly unaffected by the ergonomically torturous chair. "Also, if you could stop with the subsonic anxiety pulses, that would be great. Our audio technicians picked those up an hour ago, and frankly they're less effective than my morning commute on the subway." The hegemony delegation exchanged glances as the humans filed out. This was unprecedented. "Initiate Phase 2 immediately," the Grand Manipulator ordered. "Their resistance is anomalous." What the hegemony didn't understand was that Ambassador Chen wasn't specially trained in psychological resistance. He had simply spent 47 years on Earth, surviving standardized education, student loans, 3 economic recessions, countless political crises, climate disasters, and 15 years in public service. The hegemony's subtle discomfort techniques weren't competing with human psychological vulnerability. They were competing with Thursday morning staff meetings, rush hour traffic, and the existential dread of ordinary human existence, and they were losing badly. Day 3 of negotiations, and the hegemony had abandoned all pretense of subtlety. Their Phase 2 protocols called for escalating psychological pressure until the first visible cracks appeared in the target species' resolve. Under normal circumstances, those cracks should have been appearing around hour 6 of Phase 1. "Your species has until the next lunar cycle to prepare integration proposals," announced Grand Manipulator Zev Duran, employing their patented inevitable doom speech rhythms. "We have identified 37 critical vulnerabilities in your planetary defense systems. Resistance would be—" He paused for precisely 2.7 seconds, unwise. The human delegates exchanged glances. Ambassador Chen tapped his pen against his notepad. "Just to clarify," he said, "you're threatening us with knowledge of our defense weaknesses, while sitting in our headquarters surrounded by our security personnel. That's an interesting negotiating strategy." Zif Toral deployed what the hegemony called the crushing reality tactic, projecting a holographic display of Earth's position in the galactic hierarchy, deliberately scaled to emphasize its insignificance. "Your civilization registers as a Category 3, on the developmental scale," the xenopsychologist explained condescendingly. "The hegemony encompasses 17 Category 8 civilizations and controls resources across 3 spiral arms. Your position is unenviable." A junior diplomat in the back row of the human delegation raised her hand. "Question: if we're only Category 3, why are you bothering with us at all? Seems like a lot of effort for such an insignificant planet, unless we have something you want but can't just take." This was not how subjugation dialogues were supposed to unfold. Target species were meant to become increasingly desperate to prove their worth, not question the subjugator's motives. The Grand Manipulator signaled L.R. Valamore to intervene. The despondency architect activated her specialized neural implants, generating a low-level hopelessness field. This technique had once caused an entire planetary senate to unanimously vote for their own enslavement. "Your civilization faces 17 existential crises of your own making," she intoned, her voice modulated to trigger depressive neurochemical cascades. "Climate destabilization, resource depletion, artificial intelligence containment, nuclear proliferation, wealth inequality, information warfare, pandemic vulnerabilities, biodiversity collapse." "Tuesday," interrupted Ambassador Chen. "You're just describing Tuesday." A ripple of laughter spread through the human delegation. "Perhaps," added another delegate, "you could threaten us with something we aren't already dealing with, just to spice things up a bit." Back on the hegemony command vessel, junior analysts were beginning to exchange concerned glances. Psych Tactical Officer Mert Val, a recent graduate of the Subjugation Academy, hesitantly approached his supervisor. "The response patterns are anomalous," he reported. "The humans appear to be using humor as a defense mechanism, but our models indicate it should be collapsing under pressure, not strengthening." Increase the existential dread parameters, his supervisor ordered dismissively. On Earth, the hegemony delegation moved to psychological warfare techniques that had reduced a species of silicon-based stoics to begging for mercy within hours. They projected vivid simulations of Earth's destruction, demonstrated technology that could alter brain chemistry from orbit, and revealed their ability to manipulate human digital networks, effectively threatening everything from global communications to cat videos. The humans responded by creating memes about the aliens' anatomical peculiarities that spread virally across their information networks. When the hegemony threatened to destabilize Earth's economy, the humans laughed and pointed out that they'd been doing that to themselves for centuries. When alien infiltration units began spreading conspiracy theories, they discovered humans had already developed far more elaborate and entertaining versions. When the hegemony attempted to trigger conflict between nations by exposing diplomatic secrets, world leaders shrugged and admitted that everyone had been assuming the worst about each other anyway. On the hegemony vessel, the junior officers were now in a state of barely concealed panic. The application of existential dread is having the opposite effect, reported Psych Tactical Officer Mert Val. They're becoming more cohesive and, are they organizing some kind of social gathering? Down on Earth, Ambassador Chen was indeed organizing an international reception for the alien delegation. We thought you might appreciate experiencing some human cultural traditions, he explained to the increasingly disoriented hegemony representatives. We're calling it Threats and Treats Night. You provide the existential threats, we'll provide the snacks and cocktails. Kalik Dro, the Venari specialist in reality destabilization, was the first to crack. After a week of deploying techniques that should have humans questioning the nature of their reality, he found himself accepting a drink called an existential crisis that the humans had invented in his honor. I don't understand, he confessed to a bartender. Your species faces genuine extinction scenarios several times per generation. How are you not perpetually paralyzed by dread? The bartender shrugged. First time. Back on the command vessel, the junior officers were reaching an uncomfortable conclusion. Their entire subjugation methodology might be fundamentally flawed when it came to humans. Their psychological warfare wasn't failing due to tactical errors. It was failing because humans had already been living with worse psychological torment than anything the hegemony could artificially create. By week 3, an unsettling role reversal was underway. Without consciously attempting psychological warfare, humans were inadvertently deploying it with devastating effectiveness against the hegemony. It began with a cultural exchange program, suggested by Ambassador Chen. Since you're so interested in understanding our vulnerabilities, he proposed with an innocent smile that set off every warning sensor in Ziftoral's threat detection implants. Perhaps you'd like to experience some human cultural traditions firsthand. The hegemony leadership, desperate to identify the elusive psychological weakness they'd somehow missed, reluctantly agreed. This was their first tactical error. Grand Manipulator Zev Duran found himself in a New York subway during rush hour. The experience of being compressed into a metal tube with hundreds of humans who seemed entirely unperturbed by the violation of personal space, deafening noise, and unpredictable movements left him hyperventilating in a corner of Grand Central Station. They do this voluntarily, he gasped to his aide. Every day. Not voluntarily, explained a passing commuter without breaking stride. We just can't afford to live closer to work. Have a good one. Alar Valamore's experience at a human sporting event proved equally traumatic. The despondency architect, who specialized in breaking spirits, watched in horror as humans willingly supported teams with decades-long histories of crushing disappointment. Your team has failed to achieve championship status for 73 consecutive years, she noted to the face-painted human beside her. Yet you display physiological markers of genuine hope. This is pathological. There's always next season, the fan replied, ordering another overpriced beer. Besides, it's about the journey, not the destination. The concept was so alien to the Morsa specialist that she developed a stress rash across all 12 of her emotional lobes. Meanwhile, Kalik Dro's gastro-anthropological research led him to a human all-you-can-eat buffet where he witnessed behavior that violated fundamental principles of self-preservation. Your digestive capacity is clearly exceeded, yet you continue consuming, he observed. To a human on their 4th trip to the chocolate fountain. I paid $17 for this, the human responded. I'm getting my money's worth if it kills me. The casual invocation of death as an acceptable outcome of recreational eating broke something fundamental in the Vinari's understanding of sentient behavior. Back at Hegemony headquarters, increasingly desperate strategy sessions were underway. Their children voluntarily consume entertainment, designed to frighten them, reported a traumatized cultural analyst who'd been assigned to study human slumber parties. Their mating rituals involve voluntary rejection and emotional damage, added another. They deliberately ingest neurotoxins for recreational purposes, contributed a third. Then they gather the next morning to discuss how unpleasant the experience was while planning to repeat it. The Grand Manipulator slammed his appendage against the strategy table. Escalate to Phase 4 protocols immediately. Phase 4, reserved for species with exceptional psychological resistance, involved direct neural manipulation. The Hegemony deployed their most advanced technology, broadcasting signals designed to trigger mass depression across human population centers. The humans responded by creating a viral dance challenge based on the symptoms. When the Hegemony attempted to disrupt sleep patterns through subtle atmospheric alterations, coffee sales spiked, and productivity somehow increased. When they engineered minor but persistent technology glitches to induce frustration, humans simply shrugged and said, "Must be Mercury retrograde," or "typical Monday," then implemented workarounds with alarming speed. The Hegemony's most devastating psychological weapon, a carefully calibrated existential uncertainty field that had once caused an entire species to question whether they had ever truly existed, rolled off humans like water off a raincoat. Apparently, a significant percentage of the population had already wrestled with such questions during what they casually referred to as that phase in college. Ambassador Chen, seemingly oblivious to these escalating attacks, continued proposing ever more cultural exchanges. Each one inadvertently exposed the Hegemony representatives to fresh psychological horrors: customer service jobs, airline travel, apartment hunting, dating apps, family holiday dinners, and the concept of taxes. "We should take you through the process of filing income tax returns," Chen suggested innocently. "It's a fascinating cultural ritual." 3 Hegemony cultural attaches requested immediate psychiatric intervention after merely hearing the explanation of the process. Humans, meanwhile, began to see the aliens not as terrifying conquerors, but as sheltered exchange students experiencing the real world for the first time. They took on an almost parental role, patting Hegemony representatives sympathetically when they had meltdowns over human phenomena, like traffic jams, printer malfunctions, or the concept of daylight saving time. "Is there nothing that breaks your spirit?" Ixtoral finally demanded, during a particularly tense negotiation session. Ambassador Chen considered this thoughtfully. "Well, those little plastic safety seals that you can never quite get open properly can be pretty defeating. Oh, and when you reach the end of a TV series and realize they cancelled it on a cliffhanger, that's rough." In a final desperate attempt to assert dominance, the Grand Manipulator revealed the Hegemony's ability to control Earth's weather patterns, threatening to create devastating meteorological disturbances. A farmer in the Midwest, upon hearing this news, simply looked up at the sky and said, "Worse than the summer of '88, doubt it." In North Carolina, hurricane preparations that had been ongoing since the beginning of the season continued without interruption. In California, residents experiencing artificially induced torrential downpours while simultaneously fighting wildfires just nodded and said, "Yep, that tracks." The Hegemony had unwittingly engaged in psychological warfare with a species that had been forged in the crucible of a planet that was trying to kill them since birth, an economic system designed to keep them perpetually anxious, and a social structure that simultaneously demanded conformity while celebrating individualism. They never stood a chance. The epiphany struck during what the humans called a natural disaster preparedness drill. The Hegemony leadership had been invited to observe how humans responded to crisis simulations, an invitation they'd accepted only in hopes of finally identifying exploitable weaknesses. Instead, they witnessed something that shattered their fundamental understanding of psychological resilience. Children, actual human offspring barely a decade old, calmly lined up during a simulated earthquake, protecting their heads and vital organs without displaying significant distress responses. Afterward, they cheerfully discussed their emergency kits and family evacuation plans, while eating snacks. "You train your young to expect catastrophe?" Zif Toral asked a human educator, his voice modulator failing to hide his horror. "Well, sure," the teacher replied with a shrug. "They need to know what to do when, not if, disaster strikes. We do drills for earthquakes, fires, tornadoes, active shooters, nuclear events. It's just part of growing up. That evening, the Grand Manipulator convened an emergency session of the Hegemony's Psychological Warfare Council. For the first time in their 3,000-year history, they activated the ultimate contingency protocol, total strategic reassessment. We have fundamentally misunderstood our adversary, Zev Duran admitted, his usual commanding posture notably diminished. Our entire approach was based on a critical misinterpretation of human psychology. The breakthrough came from a junior analyst who had been studying Earth's geological and climate history. It's not the humans, she explained, displaying planetary data that caused several council members to recoil. It's their planet. Earth itself has been conducting psychological warfare against its dominant species since their evolution. The evidence was undeniable. Earth featured active tectonic plates that regularly reshuffled its